Adrian Cortez had always believed that no one would ever discover his secret. His life had been carefully polished, each detail manicured to perfection, each flaw tucked neatly behind layers of charm, wealth, and authority. That morning, dressed in his finest tailored suit, the fabric pressed and gleaming like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, he strode with quiet confidence through the golden-lit lobby of the city's most prestigious five-star hotel. At his side, with her hand resting on his arm like a prized ornament, was a woman who wasn't his wife. Adrian's smile was practiced, his posture flawless, and he moved as though the world itself bowed to his will. The marble floor beneath him glistened beneath the warm touch of the morning sun, every inch of it polished to a mirror-like sheen. High above, crystal chandeliers dangled like constellations frozen in time, scattering light across the grand hall in dazzling brilliance. The air itself carried an intoxicating blend of roses and expensive perfume, the kind of scent that whispered of indulgence, power, and secrets. Everything about the place hummed with the language of wealth, and Adrian had long convinced himself that such grandeur would always shield him. After all, money and charm had protected him for years, hiding his indiscretions behind a wall of influence and control. But that morning, as he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and casually extended his platinum card to the receptionist with the same air of entitlement he had perfected, his world shifted. His eyes, sharp and accustomed to scanning a room with confidence, froze on a figure across the lobby. The moment felt suspended in time. Walking with unshakable poise and undeniable grace was the last person he had ever expected to see, his wife, Celeste. This was no chance encounter, no dramatic twist of fate. It was something far more powerful. Celeste was not the broken woman he had abandoned in the shadows of his ambition. She was not there to plead for answers, to demand explanations, or to crumble in the face of his betrayal. No, this Celeste was different. She had become stronger, resilient, a woman who had risen from heartbreak with a quiet determination that radiated from her very being. Her presence alone shifted the energy of the entire room, commanding attention without a single word. She carried herself with the authority of someone who no longer lived in his shadow, but had stepped into her own light. Unafraid and unshakable, Adrian's breath caught in his throat as the truth crashed over him with devastating clarity. Celeste was not simply there as his wife. She was now the new owner of the very empire he believed he controlled. The company he thought was his crown, the kingdom he once ruled without question, now belonged to her. In that breathtaking instant, the facade he had spent a lifetime constructing cracked and shattered like fragile glass, leaving him naked and exposed in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine. The confidence in his stride, the arrogance in his smile, all of it dissolved into the air. He stood frozen, caught in the merciless reflection of his own actions, while the woman he had underestimated walked forward as though she owned not just the building, but the very moment itself. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you believe in the power of kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories. Your support allows us to continue bringing heartfelt, life-changing stories like this one to you. Together, we can spread messages that inspire, heal, and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. The tale of Adrian and Celeste did not begin with betrayal in a glittering hotel lobby. No, its roots stretched far deeper into a time when their lives were bound not by wealth but by love, ambition, and hope. Years earlier, Adrian had been the kind of man every woman dreamed of, ambitious, protective, and endlessly romantic. He carried the kind of hunger that made people believe in his vision, and he chased his dreams with relentless fire. But what truly set him apart was the way he looked at Celeste in those days, like she was the anchor to his restless spirit, the one person who gave him purpose when everything else felt uncertain. Celeste, radiant in her quiet strength, had been the steady force beside him when all he possessed were ideas scribbled on paper and determination carried in his heart. She didn't just stand at his side. She lifted him when he stumbled, encouraged him when he doubted, and sacrificed without hesitation when times were hard. Together they had built everything, the company born from sleepless nights and relentless dedication, the home filled with laughter and shared dreams, and the family of goals and visions that seemed untouchable, indestructible. There were nights when they couldn't afford luxuries, but Celeste never complained. She cooked meals out of scraps, kept the lights on with careful budgeting, and smiled through struggles because she believed in Adrian more than he believed in himself. And Adrian in those days had been devoted to her. He cherished her, protected her, and promised her a life where their sacrifices would one day bloom into greatness. For a while, those promises were enough. Their bond was their wealth, their love, their foundation. They were unstoppable, at least that's how it seemed. But as the years went on, and success finally came knocking, something inside Adrian began to change. The hunger that once fueled him transformed into greed. The love that had once defined him became overshadowed by pride. The man who had once clung to Celeste as his compass began to drift away, pulled by the intoxicating lure of power, attention, and the kind of admiration that fed his ego, but starved his soul. And though Celeste's love never wavered, Adrian's loyalty slowly began to crumble. But success, as Adrian Cortez would eventually learn, can be a double-edged sword. It shines brightly, promising fulfillment and grandeur, yet beneath its polished edge lies a blade sharp enough to cut away everything that truly matters. As Adrian's ambitions grew, so too did his insatiable hunger for more money, more influence, more validation from the world that he thought had once overlooked him. He had always been driven, but somewhere along the way his drive transformed into obsession. The late nights that had once been spent at his desk with Celeste by his side, scribbling out ideas and whispering encouragements over cups of coffee, turned into nights cloaked in secrecy. Meetings stretched later and later, no longer about building their dream together, but about indulging his own ego. The whispered phone calls, once tender exchanges between husband and wife, became hushed conversations with someone else. Conversations that ended when footsteps approached. When the guilt in his voice betrayed the truth, slowly but unmistakably, Celeste began to feel the change. At first it was subtle, an absent-minded glance, a forgotten joke, a distracted reply. But the small fractures widened into canyons she could not ignore. The warmth of his embrace, which had once been her refuge after long days, began to fade. His touch, which had once been filled with love, devotion, and certainty, grew distant, detached, more like a formality than a declaration of affection. What had once been a marriage, filled with fire and intimacy, had cooled into something hollow, something that reminded her each day of what was slipping away. It wasn't long before Adrian's wandering heart led him directly into the arms of Serena, a younger, dazzling socialite who thrived on the thrill of excess. Serena was captivated by the sparkle of Adrian's wealth, enamored by the luxury he could provide, and thrilled by the exclusivity of his attention. But what she lacked was the depth that had defined Celeste. Where Celeste had offered loyalty born from sacrifice, devotion built through years of shared struggle, and love that withstood hardship, Serena offered only fleeting excitement. She was the firework in the night sky, brilliant for a moment, loud and attention-grabbing, but destined to fade quickly into smoke. Adrian, blinded by his ego and Serena's beauty, mistook this temporary blaze for something lasting. He convinced himself that passion was worth more than loyalty, that youth was worth more than wisdom. What he did not see, blinded as he was that he was trading diamonds for glass. Celeste, however, was not as naive as Adrian assumed. With her quiet strength, she had seen it all. The lies whispered into the dark, the subtle shifts in his behavior, the betrayals that left invisible bruises on her heart. She had noticed everything, long before Adrian ever realized she knew. She noticed the forgotten anniversaries, the dates that once carried significance, but now passed by without so much as a mention. She noticed the faint traces of lipstick on Adrian's shirts, colors she herself never wore, marks that told silent stories she wished she could ignore. She noticed the hotel bills, the strange charges, the unexplained absences that never quite added up. And though each discovery shattered a piece of her heart, Celeste carried her pain in silence. To the world outside, she remained the perfect wife, the graceful partner of a powerful man, a woman wrapped in glamour, elegance, and stability. Guests at galas whispered about her sophistication, business associates admired her composure, and neighbors envied the seemingly perfect life she led. But behind the poised smile, behind the gowns and jewels, Celeste was quietly crumbling. She drowned in betrayal she could not confess, aches she could not voice, and loneliness that consumed her in the very marriage that once promised companionship. Adrian underestimated her in every way. He thought her silence was weakness, her composure an act of submission, her quiet suffering proof that she would never leave. But what he failed to see, what his arrogance blinded him from, was that Celeste was far stronger than he ever imagined. Instead of letting despair consume her, instead of allowing betrayal to define her, she began to transform her pain into something new, something entirely her own. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not plot revenge. Instead, she gathered every fragment of her broken heart and stitched them together into a tapestry of resilience. Celeste turned inward, pouring herself into quiet but deliberate actions that would change everything. With patience and precision, she made investments in secret. She studied the markets, formed connections, and placed her trust not in fleeting promises, but in her own intelligence. Each decision was guided not by anger or a thirst for vengeance, but by a desire to stand on her own. She built quietly, brick by brick, foundation by foundation, until her destiny no longer relied on the man who betrayed her. Adrian believed she was simply enduring his betrayal, waiting in the shadows for him to return. But in truth, Celeste was building an empire of her own, one that would one day surpass his and strip him of the illusion that he was untouchable. In the shadows of her suffering, Celeste discovered something Adrian never possessed: patience. Where he chased after quick thrills and shallow validation, she chose to bide her time. Her silence was not submission, it was strategy. Her composure was not weakness, it was strength. Every night she cried alone, she rose the next morning stronger, with renewed determination to reclaim her dignity. And though Adrian thought he held all the power, Celeste was quietly shifting the balance. With every choice he made to betray her, she took another step toward freedom. With every wound he inflicted, she built another layer of armor. And with every careless mistake he made, she inched closer to a future where his empire would crumble and hers would rise. Adrian believed he was invincible, cloaked in wealth and charm. But Celeste knew better. And though he had no idea at the time, the day would come when his arrogance would shatter, and the woman he once dismissed as fragile would stand before him not as his wife, but as his equal, perhaps even as his conqueror. The morning Adrian strolled into that luxurious hotel with Serena draped on his arm was supposed to be just another indulgence in his double life, another careless display of arrogance and secrecy. The chandelier above cast a golden glow over the marble floors, catching the shine of polished brass railings and the glint of glass doors that reflected the couple as they entered. The air smelled faintly of roses and jasmine, a fragrance chosen to welcome guests into what was meant to feel like paradise. The quiet hum of wealth and refinement lingered everywhere. Soft piano music played in the background. Bellboys wheeled gilded carts with suitcases stacked high, and staff members bowed with rehearsed precision as Adrian passed by. Serena clung to him as though he were her greatest prize, her manicured hand resting possessively on his arm. Her laughter rang through the lobby like a crystal bell, light and shallow, designed to draw attention rather than to share joy. She looked around with greedy eyes, drinking in the luxury that seemed to follow Adrian wherever he went. Adrian, ever the performer, smirked as he always did, his chin tilted upward with the same arrogance that had carried him through boardrooms and banquets alike. To him, the world had always bent at his will. He believed he could take whatever he wanted, whomever he wanted, without consequence. But then, in an instant, everything shifted. Across the gleaming marble floor, framed by the grand staircase and tall windows that spilled sunlight into the space, Celeste appeared. She was radiant, dressed in a cream-colored suit that seemed almost sculpted to her form. She looked every bit the woman of elegance, wealth, and power. A delicate string of pearls rested at her collar, understated yet commanding, and her hair, sleek, refined, deliberate, framed a face that no longer bore the softness of naivete, but the sharp beauty of resilience. Every line of her posture radiated authority, from the tilt of her chin to the steadiness of her stride. Her eyes, unwavering and unflinching, locked on Adrian. And in that single glance, his stomach dropped. She was not the broken wife he had once dismissed, not the woman he had assumed would quietly fade into the shadow of his success, nor the fragile soul he thought would be too timid to stand in his way. No, Celeste stood before him as someone entirely transformed, no longer a figure of quiet sacrifice, but the woman who now held the keys to the very empire he believed belonged solely to him. Adrian's hand trembled as he extended his platinum card to the receptionist. The motion, once smooth and commanding, faltered, betraying the storm brewing beneath his exterior. The receptionist, caught between duty and discomfort, shifted nervously. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the card, his gaze flickering between Adrian and Celeste, as though unsure which of them truly commanded this domain. Serena, still oblivious at first, leaned closer into Adrian's side. She whispered something flirtatious into his ear, her lips brushing his cheek, her voice dripping with the careless confidence of youth. But then, like a candle threatened by a gust of wind, her smile faltered. She noticed the stillness in the room, the sharp intake of breath from the staff, the silence that spread across the marble floor like a ripple in water. One by one, heads turned. Guests in evening attire lowered their champagne glasses, their conversations halting mid-sentence. A woman seated near the grand piano stilled her fingers on the keys, the music dying into silence. A businessman waiting by the elevator glanced over his newspaper, his brows raising at the sight of the scene unfolding before him. Whispers moved through the staff like a current, soft, hushed, yet impossible to contain. Something unspoken, something monumental, was about to erupt, and then it happened. With one graceful, deliberate step, Celeste advanced across the lobby. The sound of her heels striking marble reverberated through the grand hall, sharp and steady, each click echoing like distant thunder. Adrian felt each step reverberate in his chest, stripping him of the arrogance he once wore like armor. The marble, polished to perfection, seemed to carry her presence outward, magnifying her authority with every measured movement. The silence deepened. Celeste had not come to that hotel lobby to unleash anger or to seek petty revenge. She did not come to cause a scene or to humiliate him in public. She came for something far more powerful, to stand as a living reminder of everything Adrian had thrown away. She was not a spectre of grief, nor a woman begging to be seen. She was a force, a truth embodied in flesh, an undeniable testament to dignity and transformation. The silence that settled over the grand hall carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. It was the silence of a marriage built in love and destroyed by arrogance. The silence of every forgotten promise, every night she had cried alone. Every betrayal Adrian thought she never noticed. In Celeste's eyes, Adrian saw the reflection of all his choices, the late-night lies whispered into phones, the lipstick stains on his collars, the hollow excuses and the selfish hunger that consumed his love. He opened his mouth. He wanted to explain, to reach for words that might soften the blow, to cling to some excuse that could disguise the truth. But the words refused to come. His tongue was heavy, weighted down by shame that pressed like stone against his chest. For the first time, Adrian Cortez, the man who always had an answer, always found a way, always spun lies into silk, stood speechless. Beside him, Serena shifted uneasily. Her youthful confidence wavered. The shallow sparkle in her eyes dimmed as she realized she was standing in the shadow of a woman she could never outshine. No dress, no jewel, no smile could rival the dignity that emanated from Celeste. What Serena offered was beauty, but what Celeste embodied was power, power born from pain, grace forged in betrayal, and strength that could not be bought. Adrian's smirk, the one he wore like a crown, was gone. His facade cracked. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, he realized that wealth could not protect him, arrogance could not shield him, and charm could not save him. In that luminous hotel lobby, under the golden glow of chandeliers and the gaze of dozens of strangers, Adrian was no longer the master of his world. He was a man undone, a man who had gambled with love and lost everything that mattered. And Celeste, silent, composed, unshakable, was the proof. Celeste didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout, accuse, or condemn. She didn't need to unleash the storm of pain that had once kept her awake at night, or throw his sins back in his face for all the world to hear. Her silence, steady and deliberate, carried a power greater than any outburst ever could. Her presence alone, poised, commanding, untouchable, was enough to strip Adrian of every shield he had ever worn. Once upon a time, she had been the wife, waiting quietly for scraps of affection, the woman standing in the shadow of a man who thought his success was his alone. She had waited, she had believed, she had hoped, always holding on to the dream that the man she had loved would one day remember her worth. But those days were gone. Celeste no longer stood as the quiet, forgotten figure behind his throne. She was no longer a supporting role in the empire he claimed as his own. She was now the owner. She was the leader. She was the woman who had taken the jagged shards of betrayal and molded them into armor stronger than steel. And as she stood there in the lobby, sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows and dancing against her cream suit, every person in the room saw it. She radiated a power that no title, no fortune, and no mistress could ever diminish. Adrian's chest tightened. In that moment, he felt as though he was staring into a mirror that reflected not his achievements, but every regret of his life. He saw himself not as the powerful businessman, not as the charming lover, but as the man who had gambled with devotion and lost everything of true value. The glamorous world he thought he controlled. The women who fed his ego, the wealth he flaunted, the prestige he clung to like armor, suddenly felt hollow, empty, worthless. The chandeliers above still sparkled, the marble floor still shone, and yet all of it seemed pale compared to the quiet storm standing before him and beside him. Serena, the mistress he once believed would fill the void in his heart, suddenly looked small. The youthful beauty that had once intoxicated him now appeared fleeting, shallow, insignificant when measured against Celeste's quiet power. Where Serena shimmered like glass, fragile and temporary, Celeste stood like a diamond, unbreakable and eternal. The truth struck him with the force of a tidal wave. He had traded gold for glitter, substance for shadows, love for lust. He had thrown away something priceless for something that could never last. And now, Celeste was no longer his to dismiss or underestimate. She had become untouchable, not because she had crushed him with vengeance, not because she sought to destroy him, but because she had risen far above him. The life she carried now was no longer bound by his choices, his mistakes, or his betrayals. It was defined by her triumph. Yet the story did not end with Adrian's humiliation, for even as the silence deepened, even as whispers fluttered through the lobby and eyes turned to watch, Celeste did not allow hatred to nest in her heart. She had every reason, every right to humiliate him publicly. She could have shattered him with a single word, cut him down with the same cruelty he had once inflicted on her. But she didn't. Instead, she chose silence, a silence that spoke louder than any accusation, louder than any fury. It was not the silence of fear. It was not the silence of weakness. It was the silence of liberation. That silence carried dignity. It carried strength. It carried a message so powerful that even Adrian, drowning in shame, could not mistake it. She turned her gaze away from him, not to escape, not because she could not bear to look at him, but because she no longer needed to. He was no longer the center of her life, no longer the axis around which her world turned. By looking away, she declared, without a word, that her story no longer revolved around him. Celeste had carved her own path step by step, with steady hands and an unshakable heart. She had walked through fire, endured betrayal, and carried her pain in silence until she was strong enough to rise from it. And now no betrayal could shatter her, whether Adrian realized it or not. She had already found her freedom. The staff looked at her with admiration, as though witnessing something greater than a scene between husband and wife. They saw a woman who had defied pain and turned it into power. Guests looked at her with awe, whispering softly of the dignity she carried. Serena's eyes flickered with envy, sensing that no amount of beauty or youth could ever grant her what Celeste now possessed. And Adrian looked at her with a sorrow that no words could capture, a sorrow born from the realization that he had lost the one thing he could never reclaim. For Celeste was no longer his broken wife. She was a woman reborn. The staff looked at her with admiration, their eyes lingering not on the wealth she carried or the elegance of her attire, but on the quiet strength that radiated from her very being. In her calm composure, they saw something extraordinary, an unshakable dignity that could not be bought or imitated. They whispered to one another in awe, as if they had witnessed a moment of history unfold before their very eyes. Serena, still standing at Adrian's side, could not mask the envy that burned within her. For all her beauty, charm, and youthful allure, she understood in that instant that she would never hold what Celeste possessed. No glittering gown, no coy smile, no fleeting laughter could ever compete with the depth of Celeste's grace, the kind of grace forged in fire and sharpened by betrayal. Serena shifted uncomfortably, her confidence faltering, her presence paling into irrelevance as she realized. She had always been a shadow in comparison to the light Celeste carried. Effortlessly, and Adrian looked at her with a sorrow that words could never capture. His eyes, once so sure and commanding, now carried the weight of despair. It was not the sorrow of a man who feared losing power or wealth. Those things felt meaningless in that moment. It was the sorrow of a man who finally understood that he had lost the one soul who had once loved him beyond measure, the one person who had given him everything and asked for nothing but his loyalty in return. It was a sorrow so deep that it hollowed him from within, leaving him standing in the lobby not as a titan of business, but as a man broken by the truth of his own choices. In the days that followed, Adrian found himself haunted by the weight of his mistakes. His empire, once a source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. His once vibrant world seemed suffocated by silence. Every glittering chandelier, every polished corridor of his mansion echoing with the emptiness of what he had lost. Each room carried ghosts, memories of laughter that no longer filled the air, of warmth that had been extinguished by his own hand. He wandered aimlessly through the sprawling halls, his footsteps heavy against the marble floors that once symbolized triumph, but now mocked him with reminders of all he had squandered. The home he had built with Celeste, once alive with love and hope, had become a monument to regret. The very walls seemed to whisper her name, a name that cut through the silence like a knife. At night the quiet pressed in on him with unbearable weight. He lay awake in rooms that felt too vast, too cold, staring into the darkness as memories returned uninvited. He saw her everywhere. In the kitchen, where she had risen early each morning to make him coffee, her gentle smile offering encouragement as she placed it beside his papers before he left to chase the dreams they once shared. He saw her in the living room, curled on the couch with a book, waiting patiently for him to return, even as the hours grew long and the nights stretched endlessly. He saw her in their bedroom, her steady presence a soft reminder that he was never alone, even when ambition pulled him further away. These moments, once so ordinary that he had taken them for granted, now burned in his chest with an ache so sharp it stole his breath. They were no longer simple memories. They were reminders of a love that had been pure, unwavering, and undeserved. Success, he realized too late, was nothing more than an empty crown without love and loyalty. The accolades, the parties, the glittering applause of the world could not warm the loneliness that now consumed him. All of his victories tasted like ash in the absence of the woman who had given them meaning. Celeste had been his anchor, his confidant, his greatest ally. She had stood by him when he had nothing, when all he carried were dreams and determination. She had believed in him even when he doubted himself. And yet, blinded by his own hunger for more, he had cast aside the very treasure that made his life whole. Adrian finally understood. He had not lost Celeste because she was lacking. He had not lost her because she failed him in some way. He had lost her because he had been blind to her worth, blind to her love, blind to the truth that she was, in every way, his everything. And now she was gone. Celeste, meanwhile, was not broken by what had happened. She flourished. The betrayal that could have left her shattered instead became the fire that refined her. She poured her energy into the empire she had inherited, not for wealth or vanity, but to give it meaning, to carve a legacy that spoke of resilience rather than ruin. Under her leadership, the hotel became far more than a symbol of luxury and power. It transformed into a sanctuary, a beacon of hope, and a haven where second chances could take root. The golden halls that once echoed with hollow laughter of the elite now carried whispers of redemption. Musicians who had once been silenced by failure now found a stage in the grand ballroom. Entrepreneurs whose dreams had been dismissed by those blinded by profit were offered resources, mentorship, and space to flourish. Families who had lost everything in storms, both literal and metaphorical, were given shelter within walls that had once only been reserved for the privileged. Celeste's presence guided it all. To every guest who walked through the doors, the hotel whispered resilience, as though its walls carried her own story, a story of a woman who had once been wounded by betrayal, yet refused to let her pain define her. Instead of collapsing under the weight of sorrow, she rebuilt herself into something untouchable, something eternal. Her quiet strength infused every corner of the empire. The chandeliers seemed to shine brighter in her presence. The carpet seemed softer beneath her careful steps, and even the air itself felt infused with purpose, as though the building itself had taken on her spirit. The staff looked at her with reverence, not out of fear, but admiration. They knew the truth. They had seen her walk through fire and emerge as gold. Her poise became their standard, her compassion their guiding principle. They often spoke of her not just as their employer, but as the heart of the hotel itself, a woman whose strength made them believe in their own. And the guests, they were captivated by her. Whispers followed her wherever she went, not of scandal but of awe. Some spoke of the way she carried herself, with a dignity that silenced envy. Others of the quiet kindness that radiated from her, even when she said nothing at all. Many knew fragments of her story, enough to recognize the depth of her grace. She had endured betrayal, heartbreak, humiliation, and yet instead of being consumed by bitterness, she had become a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. Celeste didn't simply own the hotel, she embodied it. Its grandeur reflected her elegance. Its unshakable foundations mirrored her strength. Its welcoming glow became the reflection of her rebirth. Adrian, watching from afar, could not escape the contrast. His world, once glittering with the shallow thrill of power and pleasure, now seemed dim in comparison to Celeste's radiance. The woman he had underestimated, the wife he had betrayed, had risen to heights he could no longer touch. He had once believed that wealth, charm, and conquest defined success, but now he saw what true power looked like. It was not in possessing, but in becoming. And Celeste had become untouchable, not because she sought vengeance, but because she had transcended him entirely. Serena, once dazzling in Adrian's eyes, now found herself eclipsed by the effortless grace of the woman she had tried to replace. Her beauty, though striking, seemed shallow in comparison to Celeste's depth. For Serena had charm, but Celeste had character. Serena could turn heads, but Celeste could move hearts. Even Serena herself, in moments she would never confess aloud, felt the sting of envy. She realized that no amount of youth or allure could ever replicate the quiet, commanding power of a woman who had survived betrayal and transformed it into victory, and yet Celeste bore no malice toward either of them. She did not waste her strength on revenge. She did not need to. Her silence spoke louder than any accusation ever could. She did not look back to measure her worth by Adrian's regrets or Serena's envy. Instead, she continued forward, eyes fixed on the future she had built with her own hands. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Kind Heart Stories. Your engagement allows us to keep bringing to life stories of strength, healing, and the quiet yet powerful force of kindness. And before we close, I want to hear from you. What lesson did you take from Celeste's journey? Comment your thoughts below, because your words may be the light someone else desperately needs to hear today. For in the end, the story of Adrian and Celeste is not simply a tale of betrayal and downfall. It is a story of transformation. It is a reminder that even in heartbreak, there is opportunity to rebuild, to rise and to reclaim dignity. It is about the quiet strength that comes from choosing not to seek revenge, but to walk away with grace. It's about realizing that sometimes the greatest victory is not in destroying the one who wronged you, but in rising above them stronger, freer, and unshakably whole. And so, as Celeste stood one morning in the hotel lobby with the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, her silhouette bathed in gold, the world no longer saw a wife left behind. They saw a woman reborn, an icon of resilience, proof that even from the ruins of betrayal, beauty and strength can rise. She had become more than a survivor. She was a symbol that whispered to every broken heart that healing was possible. A symbol that told every silenced soul that their voice still mattered. And a symbol that showed the world that the end of one chapter could be the radiant beginning of another. Celeste was no longer Adrian's shadow. She was her own light,